Igor Stravinsky lived from 1882 through 1971. Now, among the responsibilities that you have in this unit is to distinguish among four composers. And I believe that it will be easy for you to do so if you set up your strategy to do so now. One way of doing this is to find something in the name of the composer that stands out. This will help you to tell one composer apart from another. For example, I've met thousands of people in my lifetime, in dozens of countries around the world, but I have never met a single Igor. If I met an Igor, I'm sure I would remember him for the rest of my life. So if I were you, I would start making some sort of association with the name of this composer. For example, Igor Stravinsky was born in the former Russian Empire, and you can in fact tell this by taking a look at his name. It ends with an SKY. Although names from various countries in Europe are improperly spelled on this side of the Atlantic with an SKY at their ends, Russian names that end with the sound ski are generally transliterated from the Cyrillic alphabet as SKY. That is, in fact, the right way to transliterate it. So it's a pretty good guess that a surname that ends with SKY, well, at least 9 times out of 10, is likely to be Russian in origin. You can associate this with Stravinsky. Since 3 of the composers in this unit come from the same country, we're going to use social caste as a way to distinguish one composer from another. And in the case of Igor Stravinsky, he was born into the noble caste. Stravinsky's parents wanted him to take up an occupation that would be appropriate for a person of his social caste, and they decided on law as a career for him. By the way, if you take a look at some of the best Russian composers of the 19th century, you will find that most of them started out in rather unusual occupations. Occupations quite distant from music. And the reason for this is simple. Most of them were born into the noble caste. It was illegal for persons born into the noble caste to practice music as a profession unless they did so in the service of the government. And when it became legal for the nobility to pursue music as a profession, a number of them simply abandoned their other occupations and took up music full-time. Now back to Stravinsky. Stravinsky, of course, went off to law school. He stayed there for a while, and then he left. So he basically came late to music. It was not a career choice that he had made early in life and prepared for. It was one that he decided upon as an adult. Although he took composition lessons with a noted Russian composer, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, for several years, their musical styles and their level of musical accomplishment are worlds apart. Stravinsky, therefore, was largely self-taught in music. Stravinsky made his early career not in his native Russia, but rather in Paris. Paris was the center of the cultural world at that time, and everyone who was anyone in the arts moved to Paris, and Stravinsky was among them. There he occupied himself as the composer to the Ballet Russe. Take a look at Ballet Russe. Ballet looks a little bit like ballet, doesn't it? Ballet with an S on it. Russe looks a little bit like Russian, and in fact the Ballet Russe was a Russian dance company in Paris. It was essentially an outpost of Russian culture in the cultural capital of the world. It had a famous Russian choreographer, Diaghilev. It had a number of famous Russian ballet dancers, and it had a Russian composer, and most of its ballets were on Russian subjects. And it's interesting to note that every single one of the ballets that Stravinsky wrote for this company has become a classic in the ballet repertory, and all of these pieces were written very early on in his career, as is the example ballet that we're going to examine in this unit. Stravinsky basically lived the life of a superstar. In fact, that's probably how I would describe his career. He was a musical superstar, right from his earliest days as a composer to the ballet russe, right up to the very end of his life. He could have lived anywhere he wanted to in the world. He traveled extensively, but it seemed that Paris was a convenient base for him, and it remained so until the late 1930s. Around this time, both his wife and his mother died, and he, like other people who sensed a growing instability in Europe, decided to make a move far away from Europe, and in fact he moved to the United States of America, where he lived for the rest of his life. And after spending a couple years on the East Coast in New York City, he moved all the way to the West Coast and settled in the Los Angeles area, where he remained for the rest of his life. Because Stravinsky lived such a long life, and he had such a very long career, and also because he was not particularly tied to any one musical style, certainly he was not tied to whatever he learned from Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, he had an experimental turn of mind, and he would try new things all the time. For example, even in his old age, in the 1950s, he took up Schoenberg's serialism and devoted himself to it for a number of years. Therefore, Stravinsky's work changed from one decade to another, and you can observe many stylistic periods in his output. Stravinsky has sometimes been called the last great composer, and he turns out to be one of the two most influential composers of the 20th century. And he, along with Arnold Schoenberg, the inventor of serialism, had a great impact on the music that was produced in the art music world for concert use from the 1940s through the present. Now, Schoenberg is among the composers in this unit, so when we come to him, find ways to distinguish Stravinsky from Schoenberg. They have certain things in common, as you are going to see, but there are things that distinguish them from each other. So those are the things on which you should focus.